The soldiers led Jesus to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at the time. It was Caiaphas who had told the other Jewish leaders, "It's better that this one man should die for the people." Annas then bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas' house, the high priest, where the teachers of religious law and the elders had gathered. Peter was following at a distance and made it right into the high priest's courtyard. He took a place mixed in among the guards, warming himself by the fire. A servant girl noticed him in the firelight and began staring at him. Finally, she said, "This man was one of Jesus' followers." But Peter denied it. "Woman," he said, "I don't even know him." After a while, someone else looked at him and said, "You must be one of them." "No, man, I'm not," Peter retorted. About an hour later, someone else insisted, "This must be one of them because he's a Galilean too." But Peter said, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. At that moment, the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Suddenly, the Lord's words flashed through Peter's mind. "Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me." And Peter left the courtyard, weeping bitterly. Inside the house of Caiaphas, the leading priests and the entire high council were trying to find evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they couldn't find any. Many false witnesses spoke against him, but they contradicted each other, and so they couldn't use anyone's testimony. Then some men stood up and gave this false testimony. "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without human hands.'" But even then, they didn't get their story straight. Then the high priest stood up before the others and asked Jesus, "Well, aren't you going to answer these charges?" But Jesus was silent and made no reply. Caiaphas asked him, "What do you have to say for yourself? Are you the Messiah?" Jesus said, "If I tell you, you won't believe me. And if I ask you a question, you won't answer." Then Caiaphas demanded, "In the name of the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Then Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror and said, "Blasphemy! Why do we need other witnesses? You have all heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" "Guilty," they shouted. "He deserves to die." Then they began to spit in Jesus' face and beat him with their fist. The guards in charge of Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and said, "Prophesy to us. Who hit you that time?" And they hurled all sorts of terrible insults at him. Now in the early hours of the morning they bound him and led him away to be handed over to Pilate the governor. And when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse. He went up to the chief priests and the elders and said, "I've sinned, for I've betrayed innocent blood." But they replied, "What is that to us? That's on you and your responsibility." Judas threw the 30 pieces of silver coins at them and went away and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury since it's blood money." So they used the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. Jeremiah the prophet had prophesied this when he said, "Then they took the 30 silver coins, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field." Meanwhile, Jesus had now been brought before Pilate, the Roman governor. The leading priests, the elders, and the teacher of religious law, the entire high council, refused to go inside Pilate's headquarters because it would defile them and they wouldn't be allowed to celebrate the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and asked, "What is your charge against this man?" And so the high council began to state their case against Jesus, saying, "We wouldn't have handed him over to you if he weren't a criminal." Pilate said, "Well, then take him away and judge him by your own law." They answered him, "Only the Romans are permitted to execute someone. This man has been leading our people astray by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government and by claiming he's the Messiah, a king." So Pilate looked at Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "Is this your own question, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate asked, Am I a Jew? Your own people and their leading priests brought you to me for trial. Why? What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But my kingdom is not of this world." Pilate said, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You have said it. Actually, I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. All who love the truth recognize that what I say is true." Pilate asked, "What is truth?" Then the leading priests continued accusing Jesus of more crimes, and Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer them? What about all these charges they're bringing against you?" But Jesus said nothing, much to Pilate's surprise. Pilate turned to the crowd and said, "I find nothing wrong with this man." But they became insistent. "But he's causing riots by his teaching wherever he goes, all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem." Pilate asked, "Oh, is he a Galilean?" And when he learned that Jesus was from Galilee, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas, who was in Jerusalem at the time and had jurisdiction over Galilee. Now Herod and Pilate had been rivals and enemies. However, when Pilate sent Jesus to Herod, they became friends that day. Herod was delighted at the opportunity to see Jesus because he had heard about him and had been hoping for a long time to see him perform a miracle. He asked Jesus question after question, but Jesus refused to answer. Meanwhile, the leading priests and the teachers of religious law stood there shouting their accusations. Then Herod and his soldiers began mocking and ridiculing Jesus. Finally, they put a royal robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. Jesus was delivered back to stand before Pilate. There was a custom at that time that before the Passover celebration, the Roman governor would release one prisoner of the people's choice. There was at that time a prisoner named Barabbas, a revolutionary who had committed murder during an uprising. The crowds gathered before Pilate's court that morning for this release. Pilate entered his chambers and saw that Herod had returned Jesus to him and had found no credibility of charges and no basis for punishment. So he addressed the crowd. "You brought this man to me, accusing him of leading a revolt. I have examined him thoroughly on this point in your presence and find him innocent. Herod came to the same conclusion and sent him back to us. Nothing this man has done calls for the death penalty. So I will have him flogged and will release him to you." But the leading priests and religious leaders continued to shout accusations and a demand for the death penalty. As he listened to them, Pilate realized that these leaders had arrested Jesus out of envy. So he said to them, "You have a custom of asking me to release one prisoner each year at Passover. So would you like me to release this king of the Jews? Or should I release the murderer Barabbas?" The leading priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas to be released and for Jesus to be put to death. As Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him an urgent message. "Leave that innocent man alone. I suffered through a terrible nightmare about him last night." So the governor asked again, "Which of these two do you want me to release to you?" Then a mighty roar rose from the crowd, and with one voice they shouted, "Kill him and release Barabbas to us." Pilate responded, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" But the mob roared even louder, "Crucify him!" Pilate argued with them because he wanted to release Jesus. But they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the third time he demanded, "Why? What crime has he committed? I have found no reason to sentence him to death, so I will have him flogged and then I will release him." Pilate ordered his soldiers and had Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip. The soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put a purple robe on him. They knelt down before him in mock worship and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They slapped him across the face and spit on him. Pilate went outside again and said to the people, "I'm going to bring him out to you now, but understand clearly that I find him not guilty." Then Jesus was brought out before the crowds wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said, "Look, here is the man." When they saw him, the leading priests and temple guards began shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" "Take him yourselves and crucify him," Pilate said. "I find him not guilty." The Jewish leaders replied, "By our law he ought to die because he called himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was more frightened than ever. He took Jesus back into the headquarters again and asked him, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. "Why don't you talk to me?" Pilate demanded. "Don't you realize that I have the power to release you or crucify you?" Then Jesus said, "You would have no power over me at all unless it were given to you from above. So the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." Then Pilate tried to release him, but the Jewish leaders shouted, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who declares himself a king is a rebel against Caesar." When they said this, Pilate brought Jesus out to them again. Pilate sat down on the judgment seat on the platform that is called Gabbatha in Hebrew, meaning the stone pavement. It was now about noon on the day of preparation for the Passover. And Pilate said to the people, "Look, here is your king." "Away with him," they yelled. "Away with him! Crucify him!" "What? Crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the leading priest shouted back. Pilate saw that he wasn't getting anywhere and that a riot was developing. So he sent for a bowl of water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. The responsibility is yours." And all the people yelled back, "We will take responsibility for his death, we and our children." So Pilate gave the order for Jesus to be crucified, and they led him away.